Hi you guys, and welcome back to my channel. So this case has been talked about for decades by people online, by people who are interested in the true crime community. I know a lot of YouTubers have already covered this case. However, I still wanted to do it because I find it interesting that mostly everybody has come to this case with a different perspective. A lot of people feel differently about what happened that day, and so I definitely wanted to bring my perspective forth and kind of open up a conversation and see where it led, because I think this case is truly baffling. I don't think I've ever come across a case that is just so bizarre, and if I had one word to describe this case, it would be eerie. After I read it and saw the photos of the crime scene and the house, it just felt so eerie and to me. And one interesting thing is that when I heard about this case and I read up on it, I instantly thought of a movie and a particular scene in that movie, and I will get into that in the theory section of this video. So there will be spoilers. I don't want to spoil the movie for you. I will definitely give you a heads up before I talk about the film because it's a good film. You should go see it. Today I'm going to be doing the mysterious, insane, bizarre disappearance of Joan RISCH. Joan RISCH has been missing for 56 years, 3 months, and 30 days. Her case has baffled people for decades. Before I get into her disappearance, I kind of wanted to start from the beginning. Joan RISCH was born Joan Carolyn Bard on May 12, 1930 in Brooklyn, New York. We don't know much about Joan's childhood, but from what we do know, she did have a very traumatic one. By the age of 9, she moved to New Jersey, and in 1940, her parents died in a fire that police actually deemed suspicious. Now, one thing that is speculated for a while in Joan's case was that since she was sexually abused and the fire was deemed suspicious by the police, people thought she may have actually started it to escape her life. However, when I dug into this case, I did find out that Joan was actually staying with her grandmother at the time of the fire, so she did not start it. After the fire, she went to live with some relatives who formally adopted her, and she took their last name Natras as her own. Even though Joan had a really rough start early on in her life with her parents dying in the fire and her being sexually abused as a child, Joan was able to really rebuild herself and rebuild her life, and she actually went on to study at Wilson College in Chambersburg, Pennsylvania. She graduated in 1952 with a degree in English literature. That's incredibly impressive, not only because of the start that she had in life, but also because of the time that she was living in. So Joan was definitely ahead of her time, and right after graduating in 1952 with her degree, she went on to work in the world of publishing. She actually started out as a secretary and then moved up to being the supervisor to the secretarial pool. Joan continued to work hard and persevere and actually wound up becoming an editor's assistant. Joan absolutely loved her job and was known to have been an extremely hard worker. However, Joan's life went in a bit of a different direction. In 1956, she ended up marrying Martin RISCH, who was an executive at one of the companies she worked at. After they were married, they decided that they wanted to start a family, and Joan actually left her job. After their marriage, Joan and Martin moved to Ridgefield, Connecticut, where Joan gave birth to their daughter, Lillian. Shortly after that, she gave birth to their second child, a son named David. In April of 1961, the family moved to Lincoln, Massachusetts, and even though they had kind of been moving around over the last few years, the family settled in nicely and integrated quickly into the community. Joan's husband Martin pursued a career at the Fitchburg Paper Company and eventually became an executive, while Joan managed the home and took care of their children. However, Joan still had that independent and passionate side to her, and she actively became involved with the League of Women Voters, which was an organization that helped women partake in larger roles for public affairs. So again, in my opinion, Joan was way ahead of her time and didn't really buy into the stereotypical gender roles that were normal for that time. Joan also expressed that she wanted to go back to work at some point and expressed interest in becoming a teacher. She wanted to share her love for literature and said that she did in fact want to go back to work once the children had gotten older. Joan also loved writing prose, visiting museums, bird watching, and she absolutely loved to read. Everything appeared to be normal for the RISCH family until October 24th, 1961. The day started off like any other normal day for the RISCH family. Martin, Joan's husband, had to travel a lot for his job, and that day he actually had a business trip, so he left in his own car at around 6:50 a.m. to catch a flight at 8 a.m. to New York City. On the other hand, Joan woke up a little bit later and began to get the children ready for that day. She served them breakfast and was getting ready to do a couple of errands that morning. Joan asked her neighbor, Barbara Barker, who would become very important in this case, if she would be willing to watch her son David while she went into town with Lillian to run some errands. Barbara had become somewhat close with Joan since she had moved to Lincoln and immediately agreed to do this, and Joan left David with her while she went off with Lillian to run errands. During their trip to town, Joan went to a dentist appointment where she scheduled a follow-up visit, and after that went to a nearby department store where she bought some PJs for David and a bra for herself. She paid for these items in cash and was seen back at the house around 11 a.m. with Lillian. After arriving at home, Joan went over to Barbara's house to collect David, and by 11:15 she was preparing lunch for both of the children. Sometime before 11:45, a delivery guy from Joan's regular dry cleaning service stopped by to collect some of Martin's suits. He went into the residence and picked up the suits, and he said that when he was in the residence, nothing seemed amiss or out of place. He said that Joan seemed completely normal and that the family seemed fine. Following his visit, Joan changed from her more formal clothing that she wore to the dentist and for her errands that day, and wound up changing into a blue house dress and white sneakers. At around 12 p.m., Joan put David down for his daily nap. This was a routine thing to do. He normally took his nap at noon and would usually wake up around 2 p.m. About an hour later, Barbara Barker came over to her house and brought her son Douglas with her. This was common since Douglas and Lillian were the same age and they would often play together. After Joan and Barbara had a quick chat, Barbara went back to her house and Douglas actually stayed at the RISCH home so that he could play with Lillian. While Douglas and Lillian were having their play date, Joan was doing some yard work and was tending to her garden plants. Now this is where things began to get extremely odd that day. Shortly before 2 p.m., Joan actually took both Douglas and Lillian back to Barbara's house without telling her. She told the children that she would be back in a minute, and the children began to play on a swing set that was not visible from the RISCH home. Unfortunately, Joan never came back to get the children. Around 20 minutes later at 2:15 p.m., Barbara looked out her window and saw Joan in a trench coat. The trench coat was over the clothes that she had been wearing, and apparently she was kind of running around and looked like she was in a hurry, and her arms were outstretched and she was holding something red. Now, Barbara again did not know that the kids were over at her house, so she assumed that Joan was playing with the children and didn't think anything of this. That would be the last confirmed time that anyone saw Joan RISCH. An hour later, which I'm assuming is around 3:15 p.m., Virginia Keene, who was the daughter of the RISCH's next-door neighbors, said that she saw an unusual car in the RISCH driveway. She described it as being a dirty two-tone sedan. She knew that it was not the RISCH's and she had never seen it before. Another local resident said that around this time he was driving on Old Bedford Road, which is Jones Street, and that he had let a car out of a driveway. Now, according to him, the driveway either had to have been the Keene's driveway or the RISCH's. Later on, Virginia Keene and her mother would say that they had no car in their driveway at this time, so if this witness was correct and it was around the same time and the location was accurate, it had to have been the RISCH's driveway. Meanwhile, Lillian and Douglas had continued to play for a substantial amount of time, and Barbara eventually ended up coming out of her house and discovering them. She checked on them and made sure that they were okay, and of course they were, and at this time she did not see Joan anywhere. At approximately 3:40 p.m., Barbara sent Lillian back to her home because she had to run some errands with Douglas in town. She assumed that Joan was inside the home, so she didn't think anything of it by just sending Lillian back home. However, when Barbara arrived back at her home at around 4:15, she was surprised to see Lillian back over at her house. According to some reports, Lillian told Barbara, "Mommy is gone and the kitchen is covered with red paint." Now, I do want to say that when I looked into this case, I actually couldn't find that interaction. I looked at the actual police reports and I was able to see one of Barbara's statements to the police, and she actually said that Lillian had come over and told her that Mommy was gone, David was crying in the bed, and that the place was messed up. So I just wanted to let you know that, since there are two different accounts of what was said, and both of them are floating around the internet. I couldn't verify which one was accurate, but I'm assuming the one that was in the report is what Lillian told Barbara. Either way, Barbara decided to go check on Joan because Lillian was literally standing outside by herself and she hadn't seen Joan for a while. When she entered the home, she saw blood all over the kitchen and found David crying in his crib. She immediately panicked and called 911 at around 4:33 p.m. Sergeant Mike McHugh of the Lincoln Police arrived within 5 minutes, and he talked with Barbara for a short period of time before entering the home. Once he entered the home and saw the scene, he thought that he actually had a suicide on his hands. He expected to find the body in one of the rooms, so he began to search the house. However, when Joan was nowhere to be found, he immediately knew that something was wrong and called for backup. In the kitchen, he found bloody smears on the walls, an overturned table, and the handset of the wall-mounted telephone had been ripped loose and thrown in the wastebasket, which had been taken from its usual place under the sink and left in the middle of the floor. Also in the wastebasket were an empty liquor bottle and several beer cans. Martin, Joan's husband, would later go on to say that the empty liquor bottle belonged to him and Joan and that they had actually finished it the night before. However, he had no idea how the empty beer bottles got there. The blood on the kitchen floor was smeared, and it looked as if someone had tried to clean it up with a pair of David's overalls that were blood-stained nearby and some paper towels. In the kitchen, the telephone directory was open to the page where emergency numbers would have been written down. Now, this was years before 911, so if you had an emergency, you had a specific emergency number. But in the RISCH home, they didn't have any emergency numbers actually written down. As the police continued to inspect the home, they found a bloody palm print and a couple of fingerprints on the walls. Although there was a lot of blood evidence, police didn't know where the bleeding had actually started. Police later said that while the bloodstains in the kitchen might have resulted from a struggle, they seemed more consistent with someone who was staggering around and trying to support themselves following an injury. However, the kitchen was not the only place blood was found. It was found elsewhere in the house and also outside. A drop of blood was on the first step of the stairway. 2 more of similar size were found at the top of the stairs, along with 8 in the master bedroom and 1 near a window in the child's bedroom. Another trail of blood led out of the kitchen and into the driveway, where it stopped right at Joan's car, which oddly enough had a wire hanger on top of it. Blood was found on the right rear fender, the left side of the hood near the windshield, and the very center of the trunk. The blood was found to have been type O, which is the most common type of blood and is also the type that Joan was known to have. Back then, they didn't have DNA testing, so they couldn't really confirm that it was Joan's blood. But of course, we can assume that since it was Joan's home and she was missing, that it was indeed Joan's blood. Even though it looked like there was a lot of blood, the police said that the amount of blood that was actually shed was about a pint. I don't know about you guys, but when I look at those photos, to me it looks like a lot more than a pint. Also, when I looked at the FBI report in Joan's case, they said in the report that it was at least a pint or more. This also doesn't take into account the blood that could have dripped and gone into Joan's clothing. It's entirely possible that she was bleeding more in the home, but that it was literally just on her clothing and didn't make it to the ground. Oddly enough, no bloody footprints were found at the scene, which means either the person that was there was extremely careful or was just extremely lucky. Another bizarre part of this case is that there were multiple odd sightings the day that Joan went missing. According to reports, at 2:45, a woman was seen walking along Route 2A in similar clothing that Joan had last been seen in. She was wearing a kerchief over her head. She almost appeared to be wandering aimlessly, looked untidy, and was hunched over as if she was cold. Between 3:15 and 3:30, there was another sighting of a woman that was similarly dressed, walking on Route 128. She was also huddled over, was kind of cradling at her stomach as if she was in pain, and had blood running down her legs. There was another sighting at 4:30 p.m., again on Route 128, and the woman appeared to be in the same condition. Other witnesses came forward saying that they saw a woman that had a similar build to Joan walking aimlessly around a construction site. Again, this woman was hunched over and was kind of clutching at her stomach as if she were in pain. This woman also supposedly had blood on her legs. In all of these sightings, no one stopped to ask the woman if she was okay or if she was in need of assistance. Police also received some reports about the two-tone car that Virginia Keene had seen in the RISCH driveway. The regular milkman stated that he had actually seen the car 5 days earlier when he made his normal delivery. Another man said that he saw a light blue sedan parked on Sunnyside Lane at around 2:45 p.m. Another neighborhood resident told investigators that she saw a blue two-tone car parked on Sunnyside Lane near Old Bedford, right where it intersects Route 2A, and that the man actually got out of the car, went to the nearby woods, chopped down some branches, and put them back into his vehicle at around 4:15 p.m., which is really sketchy. After they arrived at the scene, police immediately called all the local hospitals to see if a woman that resembled Joan had been there, and that led to nowhere. Martin Risch, after finding out about his wife's disappearance, immediately came home to be with his children. Of course, police looked at Martin as a possible suspect, but over time, they were able to rule him out. Apparently, he was a loving husband. There was nothing that made them believe that he could have been involved in the disappearance or the crime, and he was in New York City at the time of Joan's disappearance. They questioned the milkman and the mailman, and they were both in separate locations at the time of Joan's disappearance. The police also took a look at a man named Robert Foster, who some of the neighbors were suspicious of. After investigating him, they were also able to rule him out as a suspect. The case became even more mysterious about a year later when investigators found out that Joan had actually checked out 25 books in the weeks leading up to her disappearance that dealt with true crime and mystery, murder, and disappearance. One book stood out called Into Thin Air, which was about a woman that disappeared mysteriously. In the book, the only evidence that was left behind were bloodstains and paper towels. Obviously, this raised a lot of eyebrows because Joan's disappearance was very similar. With no new lead surfacing and no new suspects, over time the case eventually grew cold. Martin Risch continued to live in the same house and raise their children. He never changed their phone number because he believed that Joan was still alive out there somewhere, and he was hoping that someday Joan would call him. Unfortunately, that phone call never came, and Martin passed away in 2009. So when it comes to theories, this case has a lot of them. Some of them are definitely more common than others, so those are the ones that I'm going to focus on in this video. If we went over all the theories, we would be here for a very long time. The first theory is that Joan ran away and completely staged her disappearance. This theory mostly centers around the fact that Joan had checked out those 25 books from the library. It also centers around the fact that Joan was indeed before her time. She went to school, she went to college, she got a degree, and a lot of people felt that she might have just wanted to start a new life. Maybe it just wasn't fulfilling to her being just a wife and a mother. Maybe she wanted to just completely start fresh, and she decided that she just wanted to run away. A lot of speculation and gossip began flowing through Joan's friends that maybe she was just done being a housewife and that she just simply took off. It was also reported that although Joan got along with the people in the community, that she had different personalities with different people. Some acquaintances described her as a devoted housewife, while others described her as being very unfulfilled and wanting to do more and wanting to go back to work. It would also explain why there wasn't a significant amount of blood at the crime scene. According to investigators, I still think that there was a lot of blood at the crime scene, but they don't seem to think so. Maybe she injured herself just enough to stage this bizarre disappearance. However, why go through all of that? Why create this very haunting disappearance if you want to leave your life? Joan left her children and her husband, so I don't know why she would create this horrible scenario that she surely would have known that they would think about the rest of their lives. I mean, of course she had to think about her children and wondering what had happened to her, so why would she go through all of that when she could literally just leave? When I look at this theory, I fully can't get behind it. A lot of people again point to those books at the library. Now, Joan was a smart woman. She was known to be extremely intelligent. So, in my opinion, if you're staging this elaborate disappearance, why would you check out books in your real name? If you want to make sure that nobody knows that you staged your own disappearance and that you're alive somewhere, why wouldn't you use a fake name? I'm pretty sure back at that time they didn't have elaborate checkout systems at the libraries. So why wouldn't Joan just use a fake name? She had to have known at some point that it was possible people would notice her name in all of these books and put two and two together. So to me, it just doesn't add up. A lot of people point to the contents of the books that Joan was reading. Again, she was reading about true crime and murder and mystery and disappearances. However, we can't really judge people based on what they read. If people did that, people would think that I was literally a mountain climber who loved to climb mountains. I'm not a mountain climber. I can barely climb a hill. I can't even like do a jog for a couple of minutes. But if you looked on my search browser, you would certainly find mountain climbing, because I like to hear about mountain climbers' experiences as they climb mountains. Or even if you looked at my browser and saw all the true crime that I look up, it doesn't mean that I'm going to go out and harm somebody. It's just something that I'm interested in. So to me, you can't put a lot into that. She could have just been really interested in it, and her husband Martin said that that was actually something that she was interested in. So to me, you can't really judge her based on that. I 100% do not think Joan ran away and started this brand new life. It doesn't explain the unidentified vehicle unless that vehicle belonged to somebody who helped her run away and staged her disappearance. But again, there was no evidence of her knowing somebody that would have helped her stage this elaborate disappearance. To me, Joan was a strong woman that persevered and fought for what she wanted. So to me, I think it is entirely possible that she could have fulfilled her ambitions and also been a mother. To me, Joan could have done both. I don't think she would have given up one entirely to go for the other. I do think that she loved her children and was planning to go back to work once they had gotten older. The runaway theory also doesn't explain the multiple sightings of the woman on the road. Lincoln is a very small town. Currently, it has a population under 10,000 people, and back then it had a population that was around 3,000. So to me, if that woman was Joan, which I think it is, it's very unlikely to me that there were multiple women walking around that day that were bleeding between their legs and wearing a trench coat. To me, they were Joan, and to me, if she was running away and had staged this disappearance, she wouldn't have put herself in such a public situation. So to me, it just doesn't add up. Also, I can't see Joan leaving her 2-year-old son in his crib. There's no way that Joan would have known how long David would have been there before someone came in to actually check on him. I mean, I guess she would have assumed that Barbara would have come over at some point since Lillian was over there, but again, she didn't know, and that day Barbara just sent Lillian back home. She didn't even take Lillian back to the house, so she couldn't really know how long David would actually be by himself, and I just don't see her doing that. The second theory is that a random intruder came into Joan's home to either kidnap her or began to assault her, which led to the violent struggle in the kitchen. This would explain why the phone was ripped off the wall. Maybe Joan was trying to get to it. Maybe she actually got to the phone and the intruder ripped it off, which is why there were unidentified fingerprints on the phone. It would also explain to me why there were unidentified prints in the house. And it would also explain the unknown car that was in the driveway. However, if it was a random intruder, why would they park their car in the driveway? To me, if it was an intruder that was coming into the house at random and decided to abduct Joan or assault her, why would they park their car in the driveway? Wouldn't they park it like down the street or somewhere completely else and then just walk? You know, it just doesn't make much sense to me. But say that did happen, maybe Joan got away somehow and that's how she ended up on the side of the freeway, and maybe she wandered off and succumbed to her injuries. Maybe she got away from the home and the random intruder found her on the side of the freeway and took her and disposed of her body elsewhere. However, no one heard any commotion from the RISCH home that day. Everything seemed fine, and police questioned everyone that was in the immediate area, and none of them said that they heard anything that day. So if there was a violent struggle with a random intruder, I feel like there would have been noises. I feel like Joan would have screamed. I feel like there just would have been something that seemed more off more immediately to her neighbors. It's always possible that a random intruder did come into the home, but how would they know that Joan was alone? How did they know that somebody wasn't going to be coming home immediately? How would they have known that Martin wasn't going to be there that day? Also, it doesn't explain why Joan suddenly took the kids over to Barbara's house without telling her. To me, that points to Joan doing it because she wanted to go off and do something and wanted privacy and didn't want to draw attention to herself. However, I will say that the police actually did look at this theory, and in their reports they said that while Joan was out playing with the kids, that she may have seen an intruder in her home, which is why she took Douglas and Lillian immediately over to Barbara's house. However, my problem with that already is, why wouldn't she tell Barbara that she had seen someone in the house and to call 911? But anyways, I'll continue. So apparently she took them over there and she went back to the house because she knew that David was still in the house. According to police, the intruder might have saw Joan go over to Barbara's house and thought that that was his chance to escape, but when she came back, they unfortunately ran into each other in the house, and that is how the assault happened. Again, if this was true, why would Joan not tell Barbara? I feel like if someone is in your home and your son is in there, yeah, you would be panicked. You'd want to get to your son, but you'd also want help. And I feel like you wouldn't just walk right back into the house unless you knew that somebody was on the way to help you. So she could have easily told Barbara, I need help. There's someone in the house. I'm going to go get David. You know, help me, call the police. Also, if there was an intruder, what was the motive? In the police's theory, he was trying to leave the home when Joan had gone over to Barbara's house. However, nothing was taken. Her pocketbook was found. Nothing was taken. The home wasn't ransacked. So what exactly was his motive for being there? He went into the house to do what? You know, they're saying that Joan had gone over to Barbara's house and the intruder was like, okay, cool, this is my time to get out of here. But why was he there in the first place? It's entirely possible that in this supposed assault that he knocked Joan unconscious, ripped the phone from the wall so that she wouldn't be able to call for help right away and took off. Maybe Joan came to and had no idea what had happened to her and just was completely disoriented and walked to her driveway where her car was and maybe just didn't even know where she was at that point. Maybe she was in complete shock and that's what led her to just kind of wander off and wind up on the freeway. Some people have said that it wasn't a random intruder at all and that Joan was actually having an affair. However, Joan was in the area for about 5 to 6 months before her disappearance, so I don't know if that's enough time to kind of meet somebody and have this crazy love affair. So again, like everything, it is possible, but there is no evidence of her having an affair, and by all accounts she had a pretty good marriage with Martin. However, some people that are from the area, that are locals and are in the actual community, think that is exactly what happened, that Joan was having an affair and that they had a quarrel of some kind and that it led to an assault in the kitchen. It would explain the car in the driveway, it would explain the unidentified fingerprints, it would explain the phone being ripped off of the wall if she was trying to call for help and he didn't want her to. But again, my problem with this is a lot of the people that saw the car that day said that they had not seen it before. So if Joan was having this crazy love affair, you know, why wasn't the car seen more often? Joan was at home with the kids, so she was usually with the children, so it doesn't make sense that she would have gone off to this man's house with the kids at any point. Lillian would have said something probably. David was probably too young, but it just doesn't make sense. So why wasn't the car seen more often? And again, if she was having this affair, I think she would tell him to park elsewhere so that it wasn't so obvious. So again, possible, but likely, I don't know. To me, it's kind of down there on what I think happened. This theory would also explain why Joan's body was never found. Maybe her lover took her somewhere and disposed of her body. It would back up the blood trail since it abruptly ended in the driveway. Maybe she did get into a car and he took her somewhere far away, and that is why they haven't found her yet. The third theory is that Joan had a psychological breakdown of some kind and left the home of her own accord. Her husband Martin always for some reason believed that Joan was alive and was still out there. This is evident. He didn't change the phone number. He also thought that maybe she had injured herself in the home at some point, which definitely would explain the blood that was found in the home. It would definitely explain maybe why the phone was ripped off. Maybe she herself was trying to call and ripped it off on accident. Maybe she kind of fell back and ripped the phone, but it doesn't explain how it ended up in the waste bin. Martin theorized perhaps that she had some sort of injury and had some, traumatic brain injury and maybe didn't remember who she was, and that's why she wandered out of the home and was seen on the freeway and just kind of wandered off somewhere. However, police didn't find anything that pointed to Joan having any type of mental illness. She was known to have been very even-tempered, not to get angry quickly, never had problems with anything like that. So to me, there was no history that would point to her having a mental break of some kind, but again, it is possible. The fourth theory is that Joan had a miscarriage, and to me this fits with most of the evidence. It would explain why she took the kids so quickly over to Barbara's house and why she didn't tell her. Back in that time, people kept things like that private. It makes sense that she maybe started to not feel well. Maybe she noticed that she had begun to bleed and she didn't know what was going on. Maybe she didn't know she was pregnant at that point and was miscarrying, and she didn't really know what was happening and she didn't want the children to be around, so she took them over and was and really meant what she said when she said, "I'll be right back." Maybe she thought she would just go take care of it at her house, lie down and rest for a minute, and then go back and get the children, and it spiraled out of control from there. It would explain the telephone directory being open to the emergency numbers, even though none were written. Maybe Joan was trying to call for help, and again, maybe it was the reason why the phone had been ripped off. Maybe she herself was using the phone and was completely out of it and disoriented and literally just fell backwards and ripped the phone off. Again, the one thing with that is, why would she put it in the waste bin? Like, it doesn't make sense. But again, maybe in her state she decided to put it in there. Maybe she decided that once the phone had been ripped off that she was just going to drive there, and once she got to the car she realized that she either couldn't drive or that she maybe just didn't have her keys. Maybe she couldn't find them, and she decided to just take off on foot to go get help. With that though, why wouldn't she go ask for help from a neighbor? Again, people did want to keep things like that private. However, if you're having a medical emergency like that and you feel like your life is somewhat in danger, why wouldn't you just go for help and ask someone to help you? To me, that doesn't make sense for her to kind of wander aimlessly on a freeway and walk to the nearest hospital when she could have had help literally just feet away. It also wouldn't explain why she left David in his crib. She could have just gone over to Barbara's house and said, "I'm having a medical issue. I need desperate help. Can you please go get David and watch him for me? Or can you just call 911?" So again, to me, there are things that don't really match up with that. Again, all of it could be explained due to the fact that she had lost a lot of blood and just wasn't thinking clearly. If she decided to walk off and ended up on the freeway, it would explain the sightings of the woman that was clutching at her stomach. If Joan was miscarrying at that point, obviously it would be extremely painful and would explain why there was blood running down the woman's legs that was seen walking on the freeway. One of the sightings was around a construction zone. Maybe Joan wandered off into that construction zone, which is not the safest place to be, especially if you are not in the right mindset and you are completely out of it. Maybe Joan injured herself there or fell into one of the pits and couldn't get herself out, and some people speculate that she might have been buried alive, and that is why people have never found her body. But again, with this theory, the mysterious vehicle doesn't really make sense. Why would the vehicle be in her driveway? Why would it have been seen around the neighborhood? Why had the milkman seen it, 5 days earlier? Obviously there was a connection between Joan and that vehicle, and her having a miscarriage and just wandering off doesn't explain that vehicle being in her driveway. The fifth theory, and what I find to be the most plausible, is that Joan had an abortion that day and it went extremely wrong, and either the doctor harmed her or she wandered off and died from complications, or it was a mixture of both of those things. In the police reports, it's revealed that the police were kind of looking at this theory as well. Shortly after Joan's disappearance, they asked Martin how he thought Joan would feel if she found out she was pregnant. And his answer was a little bit odd. He said she would not have been unhappy. To me, this seems kind of like a weird answer. If you're wanting to grow your family and you are pregnant, of course you would be excited. So it's interesting that he would word it in that way. Instead of saying she would have been delighted or excited and happily surprised, he said, well, she would have not been unhappy. So that's kind of an interesting answer, and to me points to the fact that Martin probably knew that Joan most likely did not want another child. There must have been some sort of reason for them to ask Martin that question. I don't think they would have just asked that question out of thin air. I think that there definitely was a reason, and I think some of the evidence obviously supports it. To me, this theory pretty much explains everything. I think that Joan did plan to get an abortion that day. I don't think that she necessarily wanted another child. I do believe that she was yearning to go back to work and to have a more active life like the one that she had before, but I don't think it was to the point that she was going to stage a crazy disappearance and just disappear from her life and leave her husband and children. I think that Joan felt that that was her best option. And Martin was gone on a business trip, so it would have allowed her to get the procedure done and have time to recover from it. So I actually went into this case deep, you guys. I really went into it, and I came up with a theory about what I think happened. And unfortunately, I have to read it off to you guys. I can't just like tell you, because it comes down to the timeline that was given that day from eyewitness accounts, from what Barbara said, from what Virginia Keene said, to what other neighbors said, and to the multiple sightings that were reported on the freeway. So I unfortunately have to read it to you, but I honestly think that this is what happened that day, and it lines up with the times that were given to us and with the evidence that was found in the RISCH home. So please bear with me because I have to read it to you guys, but this is what I think happened. At 2 p.m., Joan takes Lillian and Douglas over to Barbara's house to get the procedure done. She doesn't tell Barbara because obviously back in that time this procedure was looked down upon. She also didn't want to bring any attention to herself. At 2:15, Barbara sees Joan outside of the home with arms outstretched, holding something red, which would be something bloody from the botched procedure. I even think Joan could have changed her mind once the procedure had started, which would explain the narrow time frame this could have happened in. However, even if she did change her mind, the damage had already been done. I think she ran upstairs to the nursery window to look out of the window to see if anyone was coming when she started to bleed. I'm not sure what the vantage point would have been from that window, but this explains the drop of blood in front of the window. Then she maybe went into the master bedroom and noticed that she had started to bleed more. I think that Joan attempted to clean up while the doctor collected his belongings, and she started to hemorrhage in the kitchen and panicked. She went to the telephone book to look for an emergency number, but there wasn't one. Obviously, the doctor panics at the amount of blood and knows that something is obviously wrong. He doesn't want to get in trouble and rips the phone from the wall, which explains why it was ripped and had unidentified fingerprints on it. At this time, the mysterious car that the doctor or abortionist was driving was parked on Sunnyside Lane. This is backed up by the witness who saw it parked there at 2:45. It makes complete sense that he would not want his car in the driveway during the procedure because it would draw attention. I think once the phone was ripped, the doctor left and maybe went somewhere to wait and see what Joan was going to do. At that point, Joan stumbled out to her car but didn't have her keys. She was probably disoriented due to the blood loss or simply couldn't find her keys. She then took off on foot to try and get help, which led her to Route 2A, which is where the first witness sighting was. Now, the first sighting was at 2:45 p.m., so Joan had around 25 to 30 minutes to get there, give or take. Everything had gone wrong or had been stopped by 2:15, so Joan would have had left shortly after 2:15. When I Google mapped how long it would take to get from Old Bedford Road where Joan lived to Route 2A, it said it would take around 25 minutes on foot. So Joan could have definitely walked to that area within the time frame, and it places her on the freeway at 2:45. Meanwhile, back at the house, Virginia Keene gets home from school and sees the two-tone car parked in the driveway at 3:15. To me, the doctor probably saw Joan leave and went back to the house to make sure that he had collected all of his belongings. He knows that Joan is on the move and needs to get her, but wants to make sure that nothing places him at the scene, and he knows that he needs to get out of there because Lillian would most likely be coming back soon, which is exactly what happened when Barbara sent Lillian back home at around 3:40 p.m. He parked his car in the driveway, probably to make things quicker or because he wasn't thinking clearly. After he does this, he backs out of the driveway around 10 minutes later, where the neighborhood resident saw him and stopped to let him out at 3:25 p.m. Around 15 minutes later, Lillian was sent back home by Barbara. Since the doctor had already left, this explains why neither Lillian or Barbara saw the vehicle in the driveway. Sadly, this means that Lillian was wandering the house for around 30 minutes until she would walk back over to Barbara's at 4:15. At this time, Joan is still wandering on the side of the road and is spotted between 3:15 and 3:30 on Route 128. I'm going to go with 3:30, which would allow Joan to have made it in the accurate time frame. She was last seen at 4:30 p.m. near Chapelleau Road. If Joan had taken Route 2A and ended up on Route 128, she would have needed a little under 2 hours for her to have been near Chapelleau Road by 4:30 p.m. Again, Joan would have left the home shortly after she was seen by Barbara at 2:15. So let's say she left at 2:20. This gives her the full 2 hours needed to be seen on Route 128 near Chapelleau Road at 4:30 p.m. I think after the driver backed out of the driveway at 3:25 p.m., he got onto 2A and maybe with luck got onto Route 128 and saw Joan walking and decided to go back where he had parked earlier, which was again on Sunnyside Lane, which intersected Route 2A, where the witness saw him exit his car, grab tree branches, and bring them back to his vehicle at around 4:15 p.m. I think he did this because he knew he was going to have Joan in his car and was maybe trying to prevent blood from getting in the vehicle, or he was going to use them to cover her once she was inside. I also think he went back to that same area because he knew it well and felt like he could have gone undetected. He also could have gone back to that area to see if there was any activity at Joan's home or if the police had gotten there yet. At around 4:15 p.m. he left after collecting the branches, and he set off to find Joan, where he found her about 15 minutes later on Route 128 near Chapelleau Road. By vehicle, it would take about 15 minutes if he took the same route that Joan took, which was 2A and then Route 128. It puts him near Chapelleau Road at exactly around 4:30 p.m. and when Joan was last seen. I think the doctor took her body and disposed of it elsewhere, and that's why we have not found it to this day. The police did massive searches around that area and didn't find anything, so to me, it makes more sense that she was taken away from the area and was then disposed of. To me, this explains the evidence that we know and fits in with the time frame down to all the minutes that we were given. Yes, it's a tight time frame, but it's possible. It explains the unidentified car and fingerprints. It explains why no one heard a ton of screaming or commotion coming from the RISCH home that day, why the phone was ripped off of the wall, and why Joan was seen walking on the highway, and possibly the beer cans. Again, Martin couldn't explain the beer cans. He did say that him and Joan had entertained guests a couple of nights before, but that Joan would usually take the trash out daily, and when they found the wastebasket in the kitchen, it was filled to the brim with those beer bottles, so he didn't really know how those beer bottles got there or why they were still there, if it was from the couple of nights earlier. If the beers arrived with a doctor, it would have made sense. It would have provided Joan with some relief during the procedure, and also during that time, doctors often prescribed beer to women to restore their iron levels. A lot of people say that there was no proof of Joan being pregnant and that wealthy women in that time were usually able to get the procedures done safely. However, Joan could have kept the pregnancy to herself. Maybe Martin didn't even know about it. Martin didn't have to know about it. Maybe she just noticed that she had missed her period that month. I highly doubt that Martin was keeping track of her menstrual cycle. It's very possible that Joan found out on her own and didn't tell anybody and was maybe thinking about it for a while before she decided to make that decision. It's also possible that Joan decided that she wanted to have the procedure in a place where she felt safe, which was her home. It's not unheard of for these procedures to take place in a home. Yes, they are normally done in actual locations. However, it's not impossible that it was done in Joan's home. I do want to say that there was an update in this case, and I say that kind of lightly because it's kind of just another theory. However, a man from New Hampshire named Lawrence Ford took an interest in this case and spent $90,000 and 12 years reinvestigating it. He collected multiple documents about the case and gained access to a lot of information through the Freedom of Information Act. And he actually came to the conclusion that the people that were responsible for Joan RISCH's death were Barbara Barker and her husband. In his investigation, he was led to believe that there was some type of land dispute between the Barkers and the RISCHs, and that is why they killed Joan. And he says that Joan is buried on one of their pieces of property. He went so far as to actually give a photo that literally points out where Joan's body is. Again, there isn't a whole lot of information about what led him to believe this. Part of the documents that he released did go into this a little bit, but they were incomplete, so we weren't able to see everything that was in them. But there was something about land, and it involved the RISCH home. And apparently they had a dispute over land and something else. I really don't know the exact details because, again, it wasn't fully released. I mean, I did want to include that in the video because, again, it is a possibility. However, again, is a dispute over land motive enough to kill somebody? Why would they just kill Joan? Why wouldn't they kill Martin too? So to me, just kind of, again, doesn't make a whole lot of sense. There are a lot of holes in this theory, but I did want to put it in the video also because He literally publicly named them as her killers, and that's a pretty bold move to do. Maybe there is more evidence that leads him in that direction that we just haven't seen and hasn't been released to the public. I don't really believe it. To me, it doesn't match up. I'm assuming that the police interviewed the Barkers, and I would hope that they fingerprinted them and compared it to the fingerprints that were found in the RISCH home. But again, I don't know if that happened. I don't know if they did take their fingerprints in the investigation, but I do know that they obviously ruled them out as suspects and interviewed them. Everything cannot be wrapped up into a bow in this case. That is why people have been talking about it for so long. There's no way to put all of the evidence that we were given and the time frame and put it into one theory and have it completely 100% make sense. It's almost like once you get behind one theory, you start to put all the evidence in there, you start to totally build this theory, and then one piece of evidence completely just blows it all up. However, I do think that what I laid out is what happened that day. Again, it is my personal opinion. And again, at the beginning of the video, I told you that when I read up on this case, it instantly reminded me of a scene in a film. Again, spoilers coming your way. It is the film Revolutionary Road with Kate Winslet and Leonardo DiCaprio. I actually wrote a paper on Kate Winslet's character in this film for my psychology class in college, and it is very similar. It was set in the 1950s and is about a married couple who are really at war with one another. They're really trying to fit into the gender stereotypes that have been placed on them, and Kate Winslet's character really was kind of ahead of her time. She didn't want to just stay at home. She loved her kids, but she really wanted to travel and experience the world, and she found out that she was pregnant in the film. And she decided that her best option at that time was to get an abortion. And in the film, I kid you not, it was really crazy. It was almost like the film and kind of what happened on the day that Joan went missing was very similar. In both cases, both women woke up seemingly normal. They had breakfast. Everything seemed fine, almost kind of like the calm before the storm. And, you know, in the movie, Kate decided to do the procedure at home, and it went horribly wrong. And I kid you not, she walks up to the window and notices that she's bleeding and leaves drops of blood in front of the window, just like Joan's case where they found the blood drop in front of the window. So it's very crazy to me, and unfortunately I don't want to give away anything else in the film, but it just kind of reminded me of that, and I'm going to put the scene from the film in here so you can see it, and let me know if it kind of creeps you out and makes you feel the same way that it made me feel, because I instantly thought of Joan Rish's case. I do want to say, as I'm putting this video out there, that I'm not judging Joan RISCH or the decisions that she made that day. I'm literally just trying to put out what I think happened based on the evidence that we have. So I'm interested to hear what your theories are in this case. Obviously, there's a reason why it has baffled people for decades. So let me know what you think. What theory sticks out the most to you? I definitely am interested to hear your opinions. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up for me and don't forget to subscribe. And with that, I'm going to go, but I will see you on my next video. Bye.